We are going to follow the money.
Everything you need to know can be understood with this simple phrase: follow the money. And believe me, that's what's happened.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Welcome to College Sports Follow the Money, an all-new podcast diving into the critical issues surrounding the big business of college sports. I'm Andrew Monaco, joined by former president of Texas A&M University and former chancellor at the University of Missouri, Dr. Bowen Loftin, and former vice president and general manager of Fox Sports Southwest, Jon Heidtke. From NIL to the transfer portal and opt-outs, to the college football playoff, conference realignment, and more, we tackle the key issues facing college athletics today and into the future.
I need to feel you, Jerry! Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money! Show me the money! You love this black man!
We welcome you into our newest edition, College Sports Follow the Money, along with Dr. Bowen Loftin, with Jon Heidtke. I'm Andrew Monaco. So glad you are with us. What a week it has been as college sports have been affected. Oh, and fellas, we're about to follow some serious money right now. First of all, howdy to both of you. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Andrew. I mean, I know you came back from Hoover, a little beaten up, but you came back anyway. We're glad to see you again face to face.
Appreciate that.
Always good to get together with you gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Jon. Dr. Loftin, let's start with you. Now that there has been settlement, we have talked about January 2025 for so long, about a settlement of the suit against college sports and this affecting all of NIL and the ever expanding. We have a settlement. We now have a dollar figure. Can you lead us to, as we talk here today on this podcast, about where we are right now and how everything that happened in what was a whirlwind week?
It was a whirlwind week. I knew about this about a week or so, 10 days ago. It was going to move to a specific date for concluding things. That date was Thursday of this week. Let me begin, though, by just mentioning one name to you, Claudia Wilken. I'm not sure everybody recognizes that name, but she may go down in history as the most impactful person ever in terms of college sports. She's the judge that for the last decade has either decided or is involved now in deciding almost all the major cases against the NCAA. And she's a judge, federal judge in the Northern District of California. She was appointed by Bill Clinton to that role. She graduated from Stanford University with a bachelor's degree in 1971, my class year at Texas A&M. She went on to Berkeley Law School. After practicing law for a time, Clinton made her a federal judge, where she still is. I think she's a very bright lady. She's extremely intelligent, extremely versed in the law. But as far as I can tell, I have searched diligently, folks, to see any evidence that she ever played a sport in her life. And I can't find it. Maybe she did. I just can't find an evidence of that. And I think that's reflected in part in her decisions. She doesn't grasp college sports from the perspective of having been a player, even having been a fan, probably, of college sports. So this woman is making major impactful decisions about the future of college sports. Yet her context is, in my opinion, deficient for this. So enough preaching about that. Here's the situation. Thursday of this week, all five of the Power Five, if you want to count Pac, still in that number, agreed with the NCAA boards to a decision to settle the House versus NCAA case. Along with that settlement agreement was agreement to fold two other cases into House under Wilken in California. Unfortunately, the Colorado case did not get folded, and that judge refused to let the case be lumped in with the other three in California under Judge Wilken. That may not stand forever, but that's the way it is for the moment here. But here's the basic framework of what's going on here. The Power Five and the NCAA agreed to a $2.77 billion settlement with players going back 10 years. It's about 14,000 claims are involved here. going back to 2016, roughly, okay, the amount of money for each school to settle all of these among the 69 who are in the FBS is about $300 million per school. Now, not at one time, that's spread over years, but that gives you an idea of the magnitude of this thing overall. What I found interesting was the way that the settlement divvied up the cost among various players, many of whom had nothing to do with the settlement agreement. What will happen is the NCAA will pay 41% of that $2.77 billion. The Power Five, whatever you want to call it today, will cover 24% of that payment. The Group of Five will cover 10%. The FCS will cover 14%, with the non-football programs covering 12%. And all but the NCAA and the Power Five had nothing to do with agreeing to this settlement here. And you've already heard the squawks. There's lots of people after saying unfair, unfair, unfair. There are many, many details, many of which are not yet known to us very well. It's pretty clear that the 21 million or so per school that's supposed to go to the athletes is a cap, not a bottom, not a floor. And so some schools will pay less than that if they dare. And among the Power Five, I don't see it happening. The competitive nature of college sports in terms of attracting the very best student athletes demands, I think, that there's going to be approaching that cap's going to be there, and there'll be collectives still around that will augment that cap without following the rules, basically, of the agreement. So you will still have maybe 5, 10, even $15 million per school per year coming out of collectives into the hands of the athletes to augment the 21 million or so that school is paying them right now, which I find interesting. A nuance which I think is yet to be understood. This all deals with the past athletes. House is a past athlete, a swimmer, which I find interesting because that may be a program that goes away. He may have killed his own sport, unfortunately. We'll come back to that. But my point to you is basically that the past is what this 2.77 billion is about. Every future athlete will be compensated as well based on each school's decision about that. But they can challenge it. They can go to a judge, not to an athletic panel, not to a university administrator. They're going to go to a judge and argue that their compensation is unfair. And that judge will make a decision about what they'll be paid, not the people writing the check at all. So that to me is interesting. It's not clear exactly how this worked. They haven't released many details about that yet, but that's out there as well. Finally, I want to just mention one thing before we begin to discuss this among the three of us, and that is that collectives will still be, I think, important. They won't have quite the requirement they've had for the larger schools to date, but they will be still out there as a way to get around this $21 million per school cap. The decisions about who gets what for each school are that school's decisions, but I would envision, and I want your comments about this, guys, that at least conferences will come up with a way to agree among themselves about what that compensation should be, who should get it, that is. Is it every kid gets the same amount of money? Is it football gets 85%, which is what they pretty well generate, and men's basketball gets what they generate, and everybody else gets nothing? Men, women, most women's sports, well, no women's sport actually makes money. They can't even break even typically. And so what's happening there? Title IX is a whole unknown right now about this. Nothing in this settlement addresses Title IX. Some lawyers are saying very confidently that Title IX has something to do with this. Others are saying it has everything to do with it. So the answer there will be, I'm sure, in litigation. rather than anything else right now. But I'll just leave you to one final thing. USA Today yesterday, Dan Wolken wrote an interesting short article. I commend to all of you in writing USA Today about comparing college sports today to Red Lobster. I'll let that sink in a moment. Red Lobster is obviously going bankrupt right now. They're sloughing stores, and it's all being told that we're all being told that, hey, it's about endless shrimp. Not so. It's really about the fact that they were rescued when they got financial difficulty by a bunch of venture capitalists who did things like selling all their valuable real estate to a firm the capitalists actually controlled and renting it back to Red Lobster at double the rent. That's what's going on at Red Lobster right now. They're being milked for every ounce of cash they have by a group of people who are just out there for themselves. Well, we have a new player on the block here. It's called College Athletic Solutions. And this new entity is a bunch of venture capitalists who are pooling their resources and saying, we're here to help. We're here to help you. We're going to enable you to be able to survive this transition here by forking over cash. We'll give you $10 million, $20 million, $30 million, $40 million to help pay off the athletes you're required to pay off now by this settlement. Now, we don't want much in return. We just like to have a little bit of revenue from you. And perhaps we'll have some control over your ticket prices and your sponsorship costs and things like that. But don't worry about it. I'm exaggerating, but I've got to read you just a quick thing here from this reporter. Basically, it is extraordinarily interesting what he's saying about this particular entity here and how it's going to work. But he thinks that private equity is going to be there. So anyway, you can call this theoretical management, whatever you want. Some will call it private equity investment. Some will call it private credit, or in layman's terms, a loan. Drew Weatherford, the former Florida State quarterback turned private equity bro who cooked up this idea, has been pitching it to college administrators for months, even told Yahoo Sports, they're not mandated to pay us back the money we give them. Now, if you believe that, folks, I got a bridge for you, okay? I'll leave it at this anyway. But I think we should have a lot of conversation about this, and I would really invite you guys to react. You've talked to your own people, you read your own stuff, you thought about this. What do you think about the future of what we called college sports?
My first thought, guys, there had to be a brand new starting point, right? I don't think how they got here is very good. Along the lines of Dr. Loftin, we've talked about this before. Should have settled earlier, right? As you have always said, they've lost every case. But at some point, someone said, okay, this has to end. Here's the dollar figure that we're going to have. Yes, it could have been lower, but now we get to start all over again. As I think I said in the last podcast, we went all the way around to get right back to this same point. But now in 2024, May of 2024, we can move forward with this. Yes, there's always going to be more questions after this. Yes, people are going to hear private equity and say, "Oh, that's a great way to get out of this," right? You can do that. Then when you say venture capitalist, it gives you another thought. Again, way more questions than are here. But at some point, we had to get to here, I think, to be moving forward with what new college athletics is going to be.
Yeah, I think, guys, too, that to me, it would have been simpler if the big guys had just kind of broken off and done their own thing, because we knew the NCAA was going to have this kind of issue coming up. And how much will that damage everyone else in that process? And that's what we're going to see part of that now. We've got at least what the framework of that is, but you're already hearing the concerns from a lot of people around the country on how that's going to look. So again, to me, it still pushes that there's going to be one level of schools playing at this level of athletics, and everybody else is going to be playing below it. And again, there'll be two separate, different set of rules for those two, or for those two entities on how they play. So I think this helps start that conversation. Is our new president, Dr. Baker, likes to start. This is a conversation starter. But again, now there's some parameters, there's some legal precedents set. And again, to me, like probably both of you, is I've got a lot more questions than I have answers on this process right now.
It sure seems that way. Dr. Loftin, my thought would be this with the schools, the ones who will have enough money to do this, will they be affected by that equity? Are there some schools that will absolutely put their hand out, but is it something where you have to be careful who you're dealing with?
Well, there's no doubt. The buyer beware here. That's going to be the motto I believe we have to listen to. I don't really expect the private equity world to touch much of the Power Five makeup. I don't really see it happening. There's resources there at a high enough level to take everything. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but the 21 million roughly cap is one way to measure it. It's actually the lesser of 21 million or 22% of your athletic budget. So for smaller schools, this 21 million can be scaled down. If you're setting at $50 million as your budget right now, it'll be half what it would be for a Texas A&M or a Texas or Alabama or something like that. So there is some scaling here going on. Keep that in mind. I think that those who are part of this by virtue of this agreement, but had no say in it, are going to be pretty noisy about it. And that's right. They should be noisy about this. Whether they can win in court, I don't know. The NCAA is an organization that we all are part of. And whether we want to be or not, we're part of it. And they have some legal standing to be able to make decisions like this. And all three levels of their administrative leadership, voted to go this way. But because the lawsuit of House was against them, NCAA, and against the Power Five, that is why it's limited to this group as far as making decisions. But the decisions are affecting schools well beyond this group, even non-football schools. And so that's going to be a challenge for us there. I think the real crux of this, guys, is going to be how the money's divvied up. There could be endless numbers of lawsuits here individually by a student athlete who says, I'm being treated unfairly here. I doubt it'll be that complicated, but it could be. I think that'll be out there. I don't really believe, though, Andrew, that you're going to find an Alabama, a Georgia, calling up this College Athletic Solutions here and saying, I need a loan. I need some money. Yeah. I don't think that will happen. I think that there are many schools, though, some in the group of five, many in the FCS, that are going to look at this and say, wow, I can't make this work. And I can't afford to give up on bringing the best athletes I can get to my school. My fans, my alumni want to see us still being competitive. We're all pretty passionate about the schools we came from, guys. You know that very well. And fans, one article was pointing out, what's not going to change. This is not the end of college sports in terms of people viewing it. Quite the contrary. In spite of all the changes in the last few years, viewership, as Jon has said over and over again, is bigger than ever, right? Jon, it's not going away. Right. So college football especially is still a very popular thing. And you can look at examples of women's sports right now in terms of a couple of really very gifted players in the women's basketball world, for example. You can look all around and see at least examples, maybe not many, but some examples of women who've been very successful and have also cashed in on that a bit. So that's okay. It's going to happen. But how we make that decision of divvying up the money is going to be very interesting. And I'm willing to predict, this is a prediction, take it for what it's worth, that at least at the conference level, there'll be some degree of uniformity. I can't imagine that an Alabama and a Georgia and an Auburn will do something very different from each other, because we're looking at the same place to get players from. And you're going to be still very competitive about that. And it'll be, the difference maker will be what your collective can bring to bear. How many more dollars beyond the cap can you raise to sweeten the pot for a given player? But I think we have to also worry a lot about how this plays out with Title IX. I don't see how you read that law without finding some degree of need here to spread the wealth a bit among the women athletes within our conferences. I don't see how to avoid that. And I appreciate your comments about this, gentlemen.
Well, the only thing I would say, Dr. Loftin, on the private equity piece is that, again, I agree with everything you're saying, that I don't think individual schools are going to probably tap into that reserve or tap into that issue because of all the rationale that you said. The only area that I see where that would make sense is that, again, I think we've talked about this, and this is a prediction, and we've heard other people talk about it as well, too. If you look across the landscape of the schools that are playing sports at the highest level, particularly football and men's and women's basketball, if you are private, and again, talking just about the NFL, using that as an example, there's probably another, their NFL today gets $10 billion a year. All right. Right now, I don't think all of this stuff adds up to, or I think NFL gets $1 billion a year in terms of their rights fees. Well, get my math right, but if you look at it, is that I think, again, if they talk the top 32, top 64 teams in college football and put them in one group, that's got a chance to double what the NFL is doing in media revenue right now. So that's an area that's probably been underserved on the process for a variety of reasons. You got conferences doing deals. You don't have any uniformity at that level. So if there was private equity get in to try to help all these schools get out of whatever particular relationship they were in to build this model, that might be a place where you could see that type of stuff playing at a larger school level to help get to that point. But having said that, I agree with you. Short term, I don't see anybody who's really going to want to probably delve into that because there's a lot more devils, the devil's in the detail in that process as well. So I think the key here going forward too, and I got a couple of questions for you, Dr. Loftin. It seems like you're kind of more versed on this. Is the 20 million going retroactive, or as I've read some points that for the next 10 years, the number that you've got to put on player or that for that compensation is capped at 20 million? Did I read that correctly?
Well, I'm not clear on all nobody's that I've talked to has seen the actual documents here. They've heard things about them, but there are claims going back to 2016.
Right.
So they're claims of the past. So we're going to
That's
pay
the
people
2.7
who are no
billion.
longer. Well, House is no longer an athlete.
But the 2.7 billion is designed to rectify the wrongs of the last 10 years. Correct.
Yes. The
now
2.77 billion is going back 10 years roughly into the past, and so we're going to pay these athletes for their lost opportunity to utilize their name, image, likeness to make money. So this is going to the past and paying them what they could have made in principle. And now, the ask by House was $4 billion, not 2.77. So there's been compromises here going on, and there are other suits out there as well that have numbers in them as well that are big. Right. But I think the issue here is trying to find a way to fairly go back, not forever, but the last decade. When some of these cases began, actually going back to 2014, if you want to go back to the really first court case that was filed against this model we've had for a long time to capitalize on NIL, that goes back about 10 years. So that's what that 2.77 billion is about, as I understand it. Going forward, there's a yearly amount that this can be used to pay athletes, beginning as early possibly as fall of 2025. So the idea is that you will be yearly as a school required to come up with 22% of your budget or 21 million, and that number will escalate over time to pay future athletes. And that's going to be, how you divide it up, as I see the comments here, will be up to the school. And I'm just arguing that will be unlikely to happen on a school by school basis. At the very least, I expect conferences to make some agreements with them among themselves here to make it level across the conferences. And again, the NIL collectives may be the way that you get around that cap, basically. But my understanding is, and I could be wrong about these details, but my understanding is that the 2.77 billion is looking backwards.
Yes, I agree.
The day backwards, because the House litigant here, in fact, all three of those litigants in this case called House versus NCAA don't play anymore, and they want the money. Obviously, they're the ones suing here, right? And they've got this class action status established here. So you have the past and you have the future, but the future is going to be based on a cap. There's talk, and I think it's in the agreements themselves right now, about getting away with with the scholarship limits, but having roster limits. So you'll have a limit on your roster size, but not on your scholarship size. We don't know yet whether scholarships will go away. I mean, one could argue that, well, I'm paying this player $100,000 a year. Let them pay their own tuition and fees now and buy their books. That's a possible solution in part to what goes forward here, as opposed to keeping scholarships in place and augmenting the scholarship with $100,000 per year. I don't know. I don't think we know yet what's going to happen there.
Right.
But there is this potential for scholarships to go away or to be radically changed. But I believe we'll see a very different, sort of way the NCAA manages the competitive nature of our programs by saying you can have X number of players in this sport.
Right. So I think, again, we're seeing the professionalization of college athletics through this process. So again, my question is that what this lawsuit settles to, or at least what I think it says, is that for the $2.7 billion is from 2024 going all the way back to 2014, arguably. Going forward, this suit says also now schools will be able to pay another $20 million as your cap on that's going to some type of player compensation or athlete compensation at that standpoint, correct? So that's
why I believe it's cases.
So that would be the number that Trev Albert, is his new athletic director, on his stump speeches around the state for the coaches show or coaches nights, has been saying we need another 15 million. That 15 million is basically this 20 million, correct? If we're trying,
I think so. It's the needed revenue to be able to handle the players that will be in place as of fall of 2025. So
right.
Whoever you're recruiting for next year will be covered by this. Meanwhile, those who've already played for you in the past are going to be compensated in some way, some scheduled compensation, or maybe not all a lump sum, but some payout over time, because it'll take a while to get all this money together. And that over time will generate this $2.77 billion of compensation.
Right, but right now, of that money, when will that money be deducted from the schools per se?
Well, I believe that it'll have to happen fairly soon. If this case is settled, I mean, right now, all we have is the fact that we have 5 entities, 5 conferences, and one 501c3, the NCAA, have agreed that they're going to do this. And that has been accepted by the plaintiff's attorneys for 3 of the cases in play in Judge Wilkin court. Okay. So that's what this is about. But she has to accept this. The judge has to say, this is a fair settlement of this lawsuit. That hasn't happened. It may take her a while to do that. So we don't know until she comes out and says publicly, here's my ruling, that this particular offer is going to be accepted. So It could be totally rejected. It could be modified in some way. We don't know. All we do know is that the defendants and the plaintiffs have agreed on this, and it covers 3 cases that are in play right now in her court. But there are other cases out there. One very similar case in Colorado, which is not, the judge did not agree to let that join the other 3 cases. And there are dozens of other lawsuits against NCAA and various conference configurations as well that have other bases for them, not just this one. And so it's not antitrust. So there's a lot of litigation going forward here. And I predict much more until we see clarity. Now, I haven't mentioned this yet, but there is a hope here. In the eye of these attorneys is the hope that this particular settlement will produce pressure on the U.S. Congress to address the antitrust situation regarding college sports, as well as other aspects of this in some kind of fairly comprehensive law. So that's what I think they're hoping for right now, is there's going to be pressure now on Congress to get off their rear end and actually do something about this. It's a scary thought, but I mean, at the same time, I'm not sure what other solution there is to give clarity down the road. Without that, litigation will continue on and on and on. And my hope is we'll have at least Congress over its next term, probably beginning this fall. The next year at the latest, this fall, maybe at the earliest, getting into actually a law that would settle the responsibility of NCAA regarding college sports and antitrust, would perhaps put guardrails around NIL and all kinds of things like that, and deal with Title IX as well in terms of how this settlement affects that. So there's all kinds of things to be done here in a hopefully comprehensive law that would be forthcoming within the next 8 to 12 months. Who knows whether it'll happen or not.
Yeah. So I'm a school now in the SEC or Big Ten. I'm looking at doing my 2024-2025 budget. How much am I putting on the line item for the past sins? And I know it sounds like I'm putting in 20 million for that year for, let's just say, what the new player compensation pool is going to be. But what's my budget line item I'm putting in that right now for the settlement of the case? Would you have any idea what that looks like?
Well, presumably the budget for this fiscal year coming up, and fiscal years vary a lot, but most schools go on a September to September or August kind of fiscal year. So I think the 2025 fiscal year, which begins this fall, will be the one you try to address how you're going to handle the past. And then your 2026 fiscal year, beginning September 1 of 2025, will be the one in which you address how you're going to go forward here with your payments to current athletes. That's my guess. I can't tell you that's going to be the case, John, but I think that has to be a somewhat rational way to decide this. And I think the issue will be how much can you do in this current fiscal year coming up to take care of the past versus having to make that payment to them only partially, and then over time take out of future budgets money that goes back to past players. So if you have the cash in the bank, which I'm not sure who does, to write the full check, you're what's it going to be for the conferences here? You're talking about a check for 24% of the 2.77 billion. You can't write that check as a school. You may need to borrow from your institution budget overall. You may need to stretch out your payments over time and impact future budgets. But there is a dividing line here. I think it'll be, you're getting to the right point here. There's a dividing line, I think, between fiscal 25 and fiscal 26, where you have this kind of real change from the past to the future. But there could be past, which takes a while to take care of. That's just my guess.
Well, and that's, I guess, what the question I'm trying to get to is that if I'm running a business, I kind of like to know what my expenses are. So then I can focus on either trying to A, cut those where it's reasonable, or B, how do I increase my revenue? So I think that's the question that every university is looking at. Some have greater issues there than others. So that's what I still haven't got my arms around was what's that number that I'm going to get dinged for 2024, 2025 for past, if it's, you said it was 300 million earlier per school, you thought it was going to be, was that right?
$300 million per school over the whole range of time frame we're talking about here, not in 1 year necessarily.
Right.
So again, I think the settlement
built into that 10-year window. Then all of a sudden you're looking at, if that's just amortize it over 10 years, that's another 30 million plus your 20. So you've got a budget increase of 50 million every year going forward, just based on the two principles of this case, correct?
I agree. And that brings up a very critical point. There's two sides to every budget. There's revenue and there's expense. You're talking about the expense side right now.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with that side, not just by this cost, but reducing other costs? And I want to have us talk a little bit about that issue of how this happens. Will it result in so-called non-revenue sports going away? At least part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are sports that cost a university millions per year because they have zero revenue and they have high expenses. So what's going to happen to college sports as we see it today in terms of varsity sports? Stanford has what? Almost 30 varsity sports. That's how they win the Learfield Cup every year. Okay. And so what are they going to do? I mean, do you convert some or many of those sports to club sports and reduce the cost automatically? Do you somehow try to keep them? Do you try to get donor contributions to help offset this sport by sport? I don't know what the answer is here, guys, but I think we'll have to deal with two sides of the equation. One's revenue. You can certainly raise ticket prices, but there's limits to that. You can try to squeeze more out of your sponsors. You know about that, John. And that's one way to raise revenue a little bit. But I think the real effort ADs are going to be directed towards is cutting expenses of the type that are recurring and ongoing and free up money to put towards expenses that are now new expenses you have to have going forward. And where that dividing line is will vary school to school, I think. But I believe every AD is going to be making some very real assessments right now of how much each sport costs and how much cutting a sport will generate him as reduced expenses that can go into funding these new expenses you have in play.
John, my first thought when you say that 50 million, that is what ESPN and Fox are giving to the SEC schools and Big Ten schools just through their TV deals. Now you're starting back at zero.
Yeah, that's and that was what I was trying to make the point. I think, again, we've talked so much about this, but what is its truly economic impact at your university level or the school that you cheer for? So again, I think if you look at those two numbers, that's basically a little, I think what I read that I think the SEC was going to give 60+ million in distributions this year. I think the Big Ten may have been a little bit more, maybe close to 80. I think the Big 12 was close to 50. So, that could wipe all that out right there, and these schools have used that money to obviously pay for a lot of things. So I think to Dr. Loftin's point, we've now professionalized college athletics. Basically, this is, this I think is the official designation that amateurism is out the door here. So if you're running a professional organization, Andrew, it at the Spurs, when they look at their G League or the WNBA teams, those teams have to stand on their own or they're no longer around. And I think, again, you're going to see, or you have to maybe, again, recalculate how you do a lot of your Olympic sports. And do they all become club sports? Certainly you can find that we argue there's a path to that. And I think that's probably, as people start to take pen and pencil to their budgets, those expenses are gonna certainly be very, very, very closely scrutinized as we go forward through this process, because it's not 50 million just 1 year. It looks like this is 50 million for 10 years through this process. So again, I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on athletic budgets to really, again, really scrutinize all their costs, particularly when it comes to sports, non-revenue sports.
The AD at South Dakota was very outspoken about his 476 student athletes. Now, I get it, South Dakota. They're going to have to pay a price here as well, but they were not at the table. Big Sky Commissioner says, look, Charles Baker, I found out about this a week ago. Again, we didn't have any say in all of this. Dr. Loftin, as I'm reading every article about the settlement, it says that it's the 5-power conference presidential boards signed on this. Can you let everyone know who's on a presidential board? And are we back to academics and athletics together, or is it ADs having to react to what these boards voted for?
Well, I think every university president or chancellor listens to their AD. And there's usually a direct reporting relationship between that leader and the AD. At the same time, the boards of if you look at the actual paperwork that creates a nonprofit corporation, which we call a conference, like the Southeastern Conference or the Big 12 Conference, the Big 10 Conference, there is a legal structure that runs that. That structure is a board of directors comprised of the chancellors and presidents of the member schools. They're the ones whose vote counts. They select the commissioner. They fire the commissioner if they want to. They make these decisions. Now, they don't make those decisions in a vacuum. There are meetings typically at least once per year in every conference where all of the conference chancellors and presidents sit down with their ADs and talk collectively. When I was president of A&M, I talked to my AD every day. When I was chancellor at Mizzou, I talked to my AD every day. And so that was a big part of what I had to do to keep myself aware of what was going on in athletics that could impact the entire institution. So you keep in touch with these people. So again, I think that is what's happened is these boards have voted. And my understanding is there was no dissent. They went all the way through the 3 levels of administration or boards at the NCAA, and they went through each of the 5 Power 5 conference boards. I remind you, the PAC, whatever it is today, is still got its 12 member schools until next year, or for the summer rather. And so they're still in play. And so that I understand all 12 of the Pac-12 schools had to vote in that voting. It wasn't just the 2 remaining ones after the conference changes. So again, these are decision makers. They're there. These are people who are CEOs of their respective campuses, and they make the final vote decision. But they do so with a great deal of consultation with both their ADs as well as with their peers. If you go to a typical board of directors meeting, some of the presidents and chancellors are very knowledgeable of college sports. Others haven't got much of a clue. And so it kind of depends on who you are. When I was in the Big 12 board, Harvey Perlman was the Nebraska president, and Harvey, our chancellor. So Harvey Perlman was a track athlete. He was very knowledgeable of college sports for having been an athlete and being very concerned about it. So you have some of these people who are extremely interested in what's going on, and some who really defer a lot of their decision making, if you will, to maybe an AD or someone else in their team. But I think this is a decision that had peer pressure. I think they were told by the lawyers that they all hire that we got to do this. There's no way around it. It's probably the best deal we'll get right now. So I'm pretty sure that both the ADs told them what was going to happen, and I'm pretty sure the lawyers that are paid for by the conferences and by the schools themselves weighed in as well.
Yeah, and Andrew, I think worst case, this would have been $9 billion versus $2.7 billion. So I think that probably helped. If they're saying, look, we can still fight it, but we're at risk for $9 billion and we can settle for 2.7. I think that was probably a pretty easy sell to get across to the rest of the folks on those boards.
And kind of putting that Thursday deadline moved everything up instead of us just keep waiting for January. We may not have any more answers, but we've got at least this settled, correct?
It may not be the answer I want to hear, but I got an answer.
Exactly. And again, if you look at all the litigation out there, I'm told that the liability, all litigation was resolved against them of NCAA would be over $40 billion. So it's not a small number here, and they couldn't possibly get there. And so that's why the plaintiffs said, look, if we push this to the limit, we don't get anything, maybe, or we get very little. We share all this revenue with anybody who's owed money by the NCAA. And so I think the decision was made to go forward, consolidate as many of the big cases as you can under one judge, and try to get to the finish line in a way that leaves NCAA at least barely breathing and alive, and provides the maximum benefit to our clients that we have as lawyers here in filing this lawsuit. That's what really happened, I'm sure. I mean, Kessler's been pretty plain about it. Kessler is one of the lead attorneys for the plaintiffs in the House case, and he was pretty clear about that you can only get so much out of the golden goose here. You kill the goose, it's over with. There's no money at all in the future.
Yeah. One other interesting aspect I saw on this, Dr. Loftin, too, and Andrew, you guys have probably seen it, but it talked about, again, it didn't answer the question about student athletes being employees. But if you look at the professional model, if you look at, their salary cap or their, how they do things, basically 50% of the revenue goes to the players when it's all said and done at the NFL, NBA, at those levels. So one of the articles I read that was pretty interesting was if you take this $20 million fee that they're putting in there, and then you factor in scholarships and some of the cost of living and the Alston issues that these, if you start to add that up and a lot of athletic budgets, that starts to be 50% of your expenses at the end of the day. So you could almost argue that through this process, they almost kind of backed into a salary cap type structure that's very similar to what the professional leagues see, assuming that you lump all those other expenses in there. And from what I read, there were other things too that eventually could be added into that line item for compensation for players. So I think again that you'll see probably some more creativity in that rule. What expenses are on a university that they can slide over? Is that be the folks that run mental health, the folks that run nutrition? All those different things that the university has set up to enhance the student athlete experience, and all those costs, well, my guess will ultimately be rolled up into this line item that is considered, a compensation for the players. So I think that's something that's interesting. And again, if you do that, just back to the napkin, in most universities, particularly in the SEC and the Big Ten, that you're probably pushing that 50% level of your expenses right there if you factor all of those line items into that factor. So I think that's going to be interesting too, how that process, kind of shakes out. But I do think because of this, it's at least gotten closer and closer to what the professional world looks like, outside of the collegiate space today.
Well, I agree in a way with you, John. I think you're on the right line here. There's two issues I'll raise here. One is that the model from the pros is a sport by sport model, and I would suggest you look at the NBA versus WNBA, for example. They're very different entities, okay, in terms of how they compensate people. The NFL is one sport. It's the dominant sport, but it's one sport, okay? That's why the 50% going to the players, in my mind, makes some degree of sense here. You've got to deal with the other staff. You got to deal with stadium operations, things like that as well, which obviously dilutes that. And of course, there's a profit, because these are for-profit owners of these particular franchises. But a college model is a little bit complicated because you've got arguably 20, maybe more than 20 sports to deal with. And that's why I think there's no way we're going to see this revival of all the sports we have right now. The NFL model also has not only, they have a salary cap, but that salary cap's applied by player, not overall. I should say overall, but it's by player. It's how you actually practically apply it. Is that the one we're going to adopt here? And I've mentioned one more thing. One thing that the NFL has and other professional groups have is they have a draft, and there is a way to adjust the draft year by year that allows a school or a team to remain competitive. Will that model percolate down to college sports as well, where there's some overriding control over who gets access to the best players? I mean, that's a logical step forward, is it not? And we aren't there yet, clearly, in this particular proposal. But is that where we're headed, guys?
My only point back to your point, Dr. Loftin, is that if I'm looking to try to keep my Olympic sports around, and you're looking at this and it's based on revenue generation, we are professional now. You could say, look, getting a scholarship to play volleyball is as good as you're going to get, because we don't make enough money to make that work. So if that works, and again, you're not making money from from that standpoint. So if the leagues or the conferences adapt some type of focus on that, which is exactly, again, going back to the Spurs example, when they had the Toros and the WNBA team and the soccer team, all those things have to stand on their own. They're part of a broader enterprise, but they're not subsidized by the overall, Spurs revenue.
Right.
So, having said that, I think, again, in this professional model now, that's where it's got to go, and I don't know how anybody sees it any different. So I think that's got to be part and parcel of the process, unless the courts decide to change that process. And then if they do, the simple action is get rid of them all and just keep the revenue one. So I don't think anybody wants to see that happen either. So I think there's got to be, there's going to be, I think, some very thoughtful conversations in that world to see how we structure this. And I guess my point to you, Dr. Loftin, is who has that conversation? Certainly not the NCAA, I wouldn't think. They've kind of set this program up. That's got to be your conference and how you want to maintain and participate within that, within that structure. And I think, again, that leads to
a school by itself
can't
make that decision. The conference has to, because you got to have competitive situations out there. And would you restrict a non-revenue sport to a different geographical footprint within your conference than football or men's basketball, for example? There's all kinds of
everything's on the table, right? Everything's
exactly.
on the table.
And I think what will have to happen here is you're going to have a lot of conversations at the conference level. I think the conferences are going to be where the action is right now, especially in the Power Five and maybe the Group of Five. That's where the action has to be, to come up with a model that works for your conference. And that's tied to geography. It's tied to maybe tied to the fan bases you have. And what about these oddballs there? You look at Oklahoma, that's invested very specifically in one non-revenue sport, softball, or in Nebraska is doing the same thing for volleyball. Some schools have chosen to go after a specific non-revenue sport and largely have used donor dollars to be able to make that sport very competitive, because they've used NIL as their way to do that. I mean, Oklahoma has gone to a specific donor who has paid the bill for them to be able to pay as much as they do per player to a softball player who has really very little professional career beyond college to go after, unlike some other sports that are non-revenue at the college level, but are certainly viable at another level. It'd be so ironic to me if House, who is a swimmer, destroys his own sport. Think about that. If House's lawsuit results in the demise of swimming and diving, think about that irony that this guy caused this to happen here. That's a sad thing, but it could happen.
It
Well,
took
you
me
know,
an hour, but here we go.
our
Unintended consequences.
Our follow-up podcast, Unintended
Exactly.
Consequences. Stay tuned to that. We'll be launching soon.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, that again, we have an answer, but we also have more questions. 4 schools now. Do you not build new facilities or upgrade facilities? Do you not fire a coach because this contract looks pretty good? We have a contained cost here. And we're not going to change coaches. Maybe we'll let that contract run for another 1 or 2 years. Do you again, what becomes most important? Money going to NIL, money going to facilities, money. Those will be the individual choices for each school. And John, you kind of said this earlier, and I think it's back to, you thought it was going to be the breakaway Super Division I should have happened sooner. But I wonder if this accelerates that as well. Now that this is done, was this something that was kind of hampering that? Now it's going to be, Dr. Loftin, to your point, these conferences are going to be able to do it, set up their rules. Then do they then break away and say, okay, this is what we have. We're setting up our own deals.
I think it's certainly, again, to me, it's not if, it's when that scenario, becomes the standard quo. But I think all of these decisions that are happening today certainly push that conversation further and probably accelerate it too within the doors of all these different athletic departments and their board of regents and presidents, et cetera.
So, John, just a little bit off this and kind of the bigger picture. NBA setting up deals with possibly NBC, Amazon, re-upping with ESPN. Turner might be out, but unlike NBC that lost NFL, CBS years ago lost NFL, things like that. Turner being sub-licensed games from ESPN. 1, that's topic 1. Corollary 2, could Turner then be a player for the new Super Division I?
That's why I think, again, it's interesting. Again, there are existing agreements in place today, that need to be honored, but they're outs coming up. And so by 2030, all of these players, I think, are going to be interested in this enterprise because, again, despite all of the negativity that's floating around with these lawsuits, et cetera, people tune in droves to watch these teams play. All right. The NFL, 93 of the top 100 most watched sporting events last year were NFL games. And the college football is probably the closest thing to that model out there. And I would argue it's probably even more valuable because of the avidity of their fan base across the country. All the fans who are deep Aggies, deep Longhorns, deep Sooners. So that's why I think you hear the private equity guys circling around, because they see it from the same sort of vision, I guess, that I see it and others see it, that there's a lot more value out there that hasn't been unlocked yet. And how do you unlock that value? Yeah, you got to work through different agreements, their TV arrangements in place, et cetera, but they see value out there. So I think that's why you see them still, kind of at 30,000 feet, wanting to see where they can enter this space. And maybe what the CAS is one way to start that process. I'm not sure it's the right way, but again, there's value out there that hasn't been unlocked. And so I think that's the number one thing that I think that this enterprise has. And again, how quickly can you get there and unlock it? It's like for the SEC, one simple thing is going from 8 to 9 conference games. They weren't able to do that. That gives you, a great lot more valuable inventory of an Alabama playing in Oklahoma versus an A&M playing at Sam Houston. So those are things that create value through that process. And I think, again, all of these little things are steps toward that direction. And going back to your point is, we talk about the NBA, their deal about 6 months ago, there were people saying, they might be lucky to get, double would be a really good deal for them to see on their national rights fees. And that was a stretch back then because of what was going on in the world at that time. Today, this new NBA deal, what you hear about on paper is going to be 3 times what their other deal was. So again, think about that. Again, these rights aren't going down in value, and again, the college sports still has additional value out there that they can create in this model, particularly in the football enterprise. So I think that's what you're going to continue to see. And I think that's why all of these decisions that are happening today, what we're talking about today, continue to push the enterprise in that direction.
I
Got a
just like it
question
because
for
it
you.
always
Would
gives
you-
us something to talk about.
Yeah.
Would you see the possibility of these new expenses borne by the schools driving a particular dynamic whereby a coach says, to get the players I need, it costs this much money. I'm willing to cut my salary from $10 million per year down to $1 million per year to be able to achieve some of that need. Will coaches be savvy enough to say that I'm part of the problem? That if I continue drawing my big salary, it's going to inhibit me from getting the players I need to be able to win in my sport.
I'm going to answer that with a question. Would Jimmy Sexton do that?
No. But here,
It's a great question.
This is
It's a great question. Then do you have incentive-based contracts? We're all kind of built on the same contracts for every school. They kind of know what's doing it.
Right.
Does that shake up something like that? It's a fascinating question, Dr. Loftin.
The great Donnie Duncan told me once, he goes, you can always tell a coach, but you can't tell him much. So I would think, again, with Jimmy Sexton running that, and again, that's not enough. I love coaches. They're some of my favorite people in the world. Don't get me wrong. But I always thought that line held a lot of truth to it. So again, if they can see the value, it's going to help them win long-term. End of the day, some will be more enlightened to look at doing that than others. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of wholesale, coaches dropping their salary to, put that into their player pool.
One can only hope.
But the corollary to that is, I think when NIL came, a certain head coach told me, you're going to see more veteran coaches getting out. They're not going to deal with this.
Yeah.
More of them getting out in the next 5 years. This may drive more of them out. Will this new wave of coaches have that type of thinking? That will be, I think that'll be fascinating. It might play out that way.
No, everyone adapts. Coaches will adapt. And again, the younger coaches who've grown up in this world are going to be a lot more easier, more pliable in that world to adjust to what this new world order looks like. Somebody who's been doing it for 35 years is going to probably have a little bit more of a struggle trying to, to keep pace in this world, because it goes against what the philosophies and practices that he grew up with. So, I mean, I think, Andrew, you're spot on with that. I think, again, we probably will see it. I think this will accelerate the exodus because most of those guys are pretty well compensated now, and it's not like they need to work for the money. And again, with all these new streaming networks out there, we're all going to need an analyst on there. So, they all can find a home out there.
That's a great point.
Our job will continue, guys. Think about it. Our job continues.
It certainly will. It certainly
So,
will.
Andrew, one final comment here. I think that we didn't bring up it all today, but I did it at the last episode. And that is, there's also this idea out there of the nature of the relationship between the athlete and the school. So the NRLB is still out there. There's still a pile of litigation underway right now regarding whether a student athlete is going to be an employee or not. And that plays into this in some respects. I think the settlement may accelerate that decision-making process, and we may end up with collective bargaining and a lot of different ways we do business together in terms of how we treat athletes, not as students anymore only, but now as employees of the institution. That's a topic for a future podcast, guys.
But that goes back to a couple of podcasts ago, what Dartmouth did, right? What the Dartmouth student athletes agreed to.
Exactly. So I think we'll try to get some expertise in on that coming up down the road here. Love to be able to have the right person on board with us to talk about that in some detail.
Look forward to that. Pleasure, my friends. Thank you for this one. collegesportsftm@gmail.com. If you have a question for us, we can answer for you. For Dr. R. Bowen Loftin, for Jon Heidtke, for our producer, Nick Savage, I'm Andrew Monaco. We thank you so much for joining us for this edition of College Sports.